Good evening. This is Mason Winfield, one of the founders of Spirit Way Project. I'm with my dear Native American friend, Mike Bastine. And I think we're going to talk tonight a little bit about MADBEAR, 20th century shaman. You know, many people may think of wizards, of witchcraft, of magic as things that are just fiction, never real. Never happened. Other people may think, they may have a lot of belief, but they think of everything like that as in the past. But you know, on the reservations among Native American people, there's still a very strong belief in the power of, for want of a better term, magic. Now, they don't look at it like the Hollywood Harry Potter version where you snap your fingers and something happens, but yet, the belief in some form of beyond the lines power is still strong. And I personally am not telling you that it can't possibly exist. Tonight, we're going to talk about Wallace MADBEAR Anderson, 1927 to 1985. And we have a great authority here to ask questions about MADBEAR with. It is my friend, Michael Bastine. Mike, say hi to everybody.
Good evening, everybody. And he was a very interesting individual, had, I guess, experiences that go beyond the average or typical life. I mean, he was a merchant marine, and he expressed his travels. I think that helped broaden his experiences through, he said he actually circled the earth approximately 7 or 8 times in his travels as a merchant marine, stopping off in countries and continents and meeting cultures and people. And he seemed to have a natural interest in their basic, the fundamentals of how their culture would function, I guess you would say, in their belief system or their practice of understanding how and what a purpose of the culture and those elements within the teachings which would be handed down generational, but not, these were not elements that would be handed clearly or even across the general population. They seemed to be things that were very specific to certain people. And that was the reason when you start doing some of the research and finding out many of the traditions of these cultures were just oral traditions, oral teachings. Some were documented through symbols, and some were somewhat handed down through systematic I guess language, you would say, but not documented in a writing. So that was his main, it seemed that was his interest that he pursued.
Well, you know, many people, I mean, MADBEAR, he was a Tuscarora. That's one of the 6 Iroquois nations. They've got plenty of their own elders and power people. And the stereotype might be that Iroquois shamans would only be interested in Iroquois stuff. And that, as Mike has just affirmed for us, is completely wrong. MADBEAR sought out elders of other indigenous medicine people of other cultures, and he learned from them.
Yeah, he expressed a few of his experiences, but at that time, he was not really connecting on that level because it was so early in his life that it didn't really start to kick in. And I guess we go through every person who has some interest in this area will find out that at some stage in their life, there's a reason why they experienced certain things. And one of the things that it triggered for myself was I didn't do well in the formatted educational system that we're kind of mandated to go through. And I had a history teacher who was not the greatest teacher, but he just loved being an authoritarian and using his authority and power. And his class or his area of subject matter was the history, but he taught the segment on ancient names of the countries around the world. So for some reason, I had a particular interest in that class. And one of my experiences in the class, I really enjoyed the subject matter, so I really learned everything that was being presented. Well, in each chapter that we'd go in the next day, and he'd say, take out a half a sheet of paper, and he'd review briefly the subject matter that we had to review for the night. And he caught me looking out the window, and he asked me, Mike, what's the answer to the next question? And I said, I'm not sure. Which question were you on? And he came back with a pointer, stood right by my desk, and as I tried explaining, he would hit my hand with the pointer. And I had already aced the quiz. It was a 10-question quiz, but I tried explaining. I knew all the answers, but he didn't want to hear that. So it just kind of resonated with me. I internalized it, and I just went, I don't need him to teach. I know or will learn the subject material because I have interest in it. So I figured I would ace that class without having to deal with him. And I did. But what was interesting about that, now this is 30 years later, MADBEAR asked the question, how did Indians get their name? And he would ask this in a crowd, usually on a campus at a university. And a bunch of the students would raise their hand, and he'd let them say what they thought, how Indians got their name. And they would say, well, Columbus was on his way. He was an explorer. He was looking for a short trade route or somewhere to go. He wanted to go to India. And MADBEAR said, that's interesting. He says, then I guess you didn't really study the history. He says, because in 1492, there was no country on planet Earth called India. And when he said that, it clicked. And I said, you're right. I said, it was called Hindustan. And he goes, I said, don't confuse that with me being smart. But I said, I really had a strong interest in the names of the country's original names before they were changed. And so he said, so then how did we get our name? I said, I don't know. It wasn't in the book that we studied from. So he said, well, I'll tell you. He says, I took a trip back over to Spain, and he said, I asked permission to get into the archives with 2 translators. And he said one spoke Spanish and one spoke Italian. And he said, in Spanish, the word Dios means God. And he goes, I'm looking for a reference that Columbus would have put in his log about the people who he had met. And they looked through, and the translator said, I found it. He said, in this little phrase, Columbus is referring to the native people that he had met as Indios. And MADBEAR said, that's interesting. He says, well, what was the translation? And he said, he's referring to the people that they were in with God. So you start to see that the history or the way that we're educated is not really giving us a direction or an insight. So by MADBEAR having this part of his interest, just things that he knew are important for people to know. So he expressed that and told this portion of the history so that people understand that we're really not Indians. It's just a misnomer, or if some want to say a mistake, but he made many efforts to try to get people to understand that most of what is known or claimed to be known about certain people, it's not the truth. It's not the reality.
Well, it sounds like MADBEAR had some very refreshing perspectives on some things that everybody accepts. You met MADBEAR. I need to bring you back to base. MADBEAR was a great teacher. He was a political activist. He was a burly Tuscarora. He was not a becomingly handsome man, but he had this way of winning people over. And Mike started to really believe in this guy when he witnessed a few of MADBEAR's miracles. And I believe you met him when you were in your early 20s.
I was 22, 23.
Yeah, and you were working at this restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the story how you hurt your hand?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I think it would be interesting if you, because everybody go, oh, MADBEAR's a genius. He'll fix that right up. You know, he's a psychic healer. It'll go wham. You remember that story? Would you tell us?
Yeah, I worked in a restaurant as the chef, and we would have a contest amongst the employees, dishwashers and waiters and people, that we'd get those duplicate slip of paper that had the order on it. But at the end of the night, we had to count them up, and we'd have that metal post, that little metal thing.
It's a big knitting needle. It's basically a knitting needle that sticks up like that.
Right.
It's like, what, a foot long?
It's about 6 inches.
Sure.
So we would get a thickness of paper, and we'd have a contest of who could stick the thickest.
Yeah, what could go wrong there?
So everyone had their turn, and I got a little bit extra thickness of paper and those sheets. And when I did it, it tipped. And the point, that metal piece, went right into my thumb.
You really slammed it.
I was
you were
really
breaking the record.
I was going to break the record, and it hit the bone. And the first time I tried to pull it out, it didn't come out. So I really had to pull hard. And over the night, I mean, I washed it, but over the night, my thumb was 2 or 3 times its normal size. Ooh. So I called MADBEAR in the morning, and I said, can I come up? I says, I got a little problem with my thumb. He said, sure. He says, come on up. So I got up there, and I showed it to him, and he said, you up for a couple games of chess? So I was, not really, but we played a couple games of chess. And of course, I couldn't even compete. And he realized my thumb was the major subject that needed addressing. So he asked me, he says, do you know what cattail root is? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he says, when you're driving along the road, he says, you see a spot where you have them coming up. He says, in order to harvest the cattail root, he says, it grows in a real silty and mucky soil. He says, you're going to have to reach in really slow, get your hand down deep enough to feel where the roots are. And when you grab a hold of one of the roots, he says, just pull it up really easy, slowly. And when you get a chunk of the root out, he says, then cut it. And he said, take that home and clean it up. And he said, there'll be a couple layers of brown skin on the outside of the root. He said, peel that back. And he said, cut a thin slice. And he said, fold it in a piece of gauze and then crush it. And he said, place that directly on the puncture. And I did that. And he said, change it 2 or 3 times a day. And he said, it'll be fine. So I did that. And I went up to see him early in the morning. So I did it during the day. By the time I was ready to go back to work, one of the waitresses had witnessed that experience. And she said to me, she says, did you go get a tetanus shot? And I said, no. And she said, if you were my kid, she said, I would have just dragged you right out of here last night and I would have taken you down to the emergency room. You would have got a tetanus shot. And I guess this is part of the MADBEAR element. I asked her, I said, how long has the tetanus shot been around? Let's just say tetanus shot's been around 100 years. And then I asked the waitress, I said, how long has a cattail root been around? She didn't even connect the point I was trying to make. And I guess this is another element that MADBEAR would have used to prove a point, is that the things that are around us that have been proven over time. And by the way, the swelling had gone down and I had showed her how the thumb looked, that it was nearly back to normal in less than a day. And it's an amazing part of life, of sometimes the most simple things that are all around us. And MADBEAR's main premise, though, along the medicinal lines with plant medicine, was one level. But over time, I had seen many things that he had demonstrated using what they refer to as medicine, but not necessarily always using a direct connection to a plant. So it's more of an energy that they refer to when they're using the term medicine. It doesn't necessarily mean the kind of the definition that is used in Webster's, that it could be a pharmaceutical thing. Medicine encompasses many times accessing energies or forces that are existing around us all the time.
Well, I can see we're going to have to get back to MADBEAR. This is a book that Michael and I wrote together. This is called Iroquois Supernatural. The hard copies are pretty rare these days, but it's still available as an ebook with the publishers up in Vermont, Bear & Company / Inner Traditions International. And Mike, we're just going to have to talk about MADBEAR again. I feel like we've just hardly scratched anything.
Well, it's a major, and it's such a broad subject that it's hard to get the full story out, but we can do this bits and pieces at a time.
I'm hoping we do, because I want to get at some of the magic stories. I want to get at some of the power stories. Mason Winfield here, Mike Bastine, thanks so much for joining us tonight. One of these days, real soon, we're going to be doing MADBEAR, 20th Century Shaman, Part 2.